As people in Gaza try and rebuild their lives, the EU and Egypt are among those calling for an urgent boost to aid deliveries. In addition to the dire humanitarian situation, the UN is now warning that Gaza is going through the worst economic collapse ever recorded. They say the situation is now so severe that 70 years' worth of human development have been erased. With businesses, homes and entire communities wiped out, families are surviving on what little remains.
This has become our bedroom, kitchen, bathroom, our shower, our laundry. It's become everything. In the past, we had living rooms and we were living a nice life. Today, whatever remains in this small house is shielding us.
Now, the European Union and Egypt have issued a joint call from Cairo for urgent international coordination to ensure a full and intensive flow of humanitarian aid to Gaza. After meeting in the Egyptian capital, the EU's Crisis Management Commissioner Hadja Labib and Egypt's Foreign Minister Badr al-Abdelati urged Israel to open all crossings into Gaza to allow sufficient aid in, especially shelter materials needed ahead of winter. Ms. Labib said millions of people have lost their homes. Well, much of Gaza is in ruins after 2 years of war. The United Nations says the estimated cost of rebuilding now stands at more than $70 billion. A new report by the UN Trade and Development body, UNCTAD, says Israel's military operations have significantly undermined every pillar of survival, wiped out decades of development and leaving the entire population in what it calls extreme multidimensional impoverishment. Gaza's economy has collapsed by 87%, unemployment is at 80%, and GDP per capita has fallen to $161, amongst the lowest anywhere in the world. And even if the fragile ceasefire holds, the scale of recovery is staggering, and plans to launch an international reconstruction effort have been complicated by political tensions. Egypt has now postponed a planned reconstruction conference, and donor governments are demanding guarantees that the destruction will not be repeated. Guarantees, of course, no one can provide while the fighting continues. Now, Rami Alasseh is an economist and a member of the team working on the UN Trade and Development Organization's Programme of Assistance to the Palestinian people. He co-authored their report. Welcome to DW. Your report estimates Gaza's reconstruction is going to cost at least $70 billion. What are the most urgent rebuilding needs?
I think the most urgent needs at the time being is the $20 billion urgently needed for the humanitarian relief, while over 80% of the structures in Gaza and infrastructures and schools, hospitals, all the basic services are destroyed in Gaza. So the main and the most urgent needs for Gaza now are the humanitarian reliefs over the next 2 years. Including temporary housing, including provision of services, basic services, health and education, vaccine for children, rebuilding slowly the destroyed Gaza Strip.
Right. And how long do you anticipate that taking? You described the situation there as a human-made abyss.
Yeah. So, of course, UNCTAD has since last year has been repeating the same message. The recovery in Gaza would depend on the conditions in which the recovery will happen in. So, if the ceasefire holds, there was an international consensus and efforts in terms of financing the reconstruction, in terms of lifting all the restrictions and having a plan for the reconstruction of Gaza. It might take, even with all these efforts, it might take decades for Gaza to be fully recovered. Even if you take the 70 billion and divide it over the GDP of Gaza prior to the conflict in 2023, which was 2.7 billion, you're still 2 decades for Gaza to basically produce as much as it used to produce before all this destruction, for it to be fully recovered. Of course, that's under the conditions of ceasefire holding, international community pumping the billions needed for the reconstruction of Gaza, and for Gaza to reach a point where the economy in Gaza is independently working after the reconstruction starts.
Let's talk about the state of Gaza's economy. It's contracted by about 87%. GDP per capita fallen to $161. So for someone who is able to actually try to make money, what does economic life actually look like under those conditions?
Under those conditions, the economy of Gaza completely collapsed. Everybody in Gaza, the 2.2 million Palestinians living in Gaza, are living on less than half a dollar per day in 2024 and 2020, since basically October 2023. It got more acute in 2025, as you know, famine was confirmed back in August 2025. So if you talk about economics, there is nothing left in Gaza to talk about. Recovery will take decades and a lot of efforts and billions of dollars and political will by member states and by the parties to the agreement that was signed back in October for Gaza to recover. If we talk about how does it look like in Gaza, basically when you talk about 80% of the Gaza Strip is destroyed, kids, the 1 million children living in Gaza haven't been to school for over 2 years now. This, in terms of the development, the consequences of what happened in the past 2 years will basically continue to haunt people in Gaza for the next generations or so. And it will take decades for it to even become normal again.
Something a lot of people who don't follow these matters closely won't be aware of is that Israel collects things like import duties, VAT, and various other taxes on behalf of the Palestinian Authority. And Israel is supposed to pass that money on. And your report indicates that this hasn't been happening. And so, you say, has contributed to what you call the worst fiscal crisis in Palestinian government history.
So, according to the Paris Protocol, which governed the economic relations between the Palestinians and Israelis since the Oslo Accords were signed, the Israelis, because they control all the borders, they control the trade, there's a custom union between the Palestinian, back then the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli government. So we are in the Palestinians and Israelis are in a custom union and a monetary union, since Israel controls all the borders. They collect the Palestinian taxes, and they because of that, they also they deduct 3% as collection fee from the Palestinian revenues on a monthly basis. Now, since 2019, Israel, of course, has been unilaterally deducting amounts related to Palestinian prisoners, or what they call Palestinian prisoner and martyrs payment that the Palestinian government paid. And after that, since October 7th, the Israeli government also started deducting 75 million shekels, which out of the equivalent to almost $20 million from these revenues that they collect every month. And it's the payments that the Palestinian government pays in Gaza, like social support or salaries for the Palestinian government employees in Gaza. And since then, these amounts has accumulated heavily, and now they're reaching over $2 billion, which contributed to the worst fiscal crisis that the Palestinian government had. Since October 2023, and even before that, the Palestinian government has been able to pay its employees full salary. They're paying 60%, 70%, and accumulating billions of dollars in arrears to suppliers and private sector.
And this is because Israel is withholding this money.
And the second aspect is that the Palestinian economy has contracted the worst economic contraction in its history in 2024, which also contribute to that the revenues actually are much less than what it used to be. Israel is deducting the same amounts, so the Palestinian government is left with nothing to accept from whatever comes from donors and domestically collected taxes.
Finish by having a quick look at what the future might look like. 10 days ago, the UN Security Council backed phase 2 of Donald Trump's 20-point plan for Gaza and called for demilitarization, an international stabilization force and a vetted technocratic administration. How does that plan align with the UN Trade and Development Organization's recommendations for Gaza's long-term recovery? Are you both moving in the same direction?
Of course, the first recommendation and the report that a ceasefire should be reached, and this ceasefire should be a permanent ceasefire where it creates the conditions for Gaza to start recovering in terms of its economy. It also creates the conditions for donors to be able to pump the money needed for humanitarian relief, for service delivery to be restored, and for Gaza to start recovering and to alleviate the suffering of the people in Gaza. The two plans, in essence, they move in the same direction. Of course, the technicalities, the politics of it is different. Our Secretary General, Madam Rebecca Greenspan, welcomed the Security Council resolution, and it's a step in the right direction for Gaza to be in the right conditions to be rebuilt, and for the suffering of the people in Gaza to be alleviated.
Thank you so much for talking us through that. Rami Alessa from the UN's Programme of Assistance to the Palestinian People.
Thank you so much.